Carl Schmitt's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, 1926, is a profound critique of the parliamentary system, focusing on the political and philosophical challenges it faced during the Weimar Republic era in Germany. Schmitt, a conservative legal and political theorist, is known for his controversial views on the nature of democracy, sovereignty, and the state. In this work, Schmitt argues that parliamentary democracy, especially in its modern form, has reached a crisis point due to a combination of factors that render it ineffective in responding to the needs of the state. This essay explores the key themes and ideas presented in Schmitt's critique, examining his thoughts on the nature of parliamentary democracy, the role of political parties, the concept of sovereignty, and the rise of authoritarian alternatives. The nature of parliamentary democracy. Schmitt's analysis of parliamentary democracy is rooted in his understanding of the political system's fundamental weaknesses. He begins by questioning the very essence of democracy as it was practiced in the Weimar Republic, emphasizing that democracy should not simply be equated with parliamentary procedures or electoral mechanisms. According to Schmitt, the notion of democracy has become detached from the real, concrete actions of politics. Instead, it has become a system dominated by formal procedures and institutional mechanisms that are disconnected from the people's direct political will. For Schmitt, parliamentary democracy becomes a hollow shell when it operates purely through negotiation and compromise between parties. He criticizes the tendency of parliamentary systems to focus on proceduralism rather than substantive decision-making. In this view, the role of the representative becomes purely formal. The representative no longer acts as a direct embodiment of the will of the people, but instead operates within a system of party interests, tactical negotiations, and legislative gridlock. The role of political parties. One of Schmitt's most important critiques of parliamentary democracy is its dependence on political parties. Political parties, in his view, are not simply organizations that represent the interests of different segments of society. They are fundamentally disruptive to the political process. Schmitt believes that parties, especially in the modern era, are incapable of forging genuine political unity. Instead, they fragment the political will of the people into competing factions. This fragmentation prevents the state from effectively responding to crises or making decisive decisions. In Schmitt's view, the political party system leads to the parliamentary game, in which elected representatives prioritize their party's interests over the common good. The endless cycle of bargaining and maneuvering between competing parties results in a lack of real decision-making and weakens the ability of the state to act with authority. Schmitt's analysis of the party system reveals a pessimistic view of democratic politics, in which the ideal of the people's will being represented in government is undermined by the reality of partisan competition and institutional dysfunction. Sovereignty and the state of emergency. A central theme of Schmitt's critique is the concept of sovereignty. Sovereignty for Schmitt is the ability to make decisions, particularly in moments of crisis. In The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, Schmitt emphasizes that sovereignty is not a theoretical construct, but a practical function that enables the state to act decisively. He argues that parliamentary democracy's dependence on procedure and party negotiations limits the state's ability to act quickly and decisively in moments of crisis. In Schmitt's view, the state of emergency is a crucial element of sovereignty. He famously defines the sovereign as the one who decides on the exception, meaning that the sovereign's authority must extend beyond the normal rules of law and procedure to enable decisive action during exceptional circumstances. Schmitt's concern is that parliamentary systems, by relying on procedures and consensus building, are incapable of making decisions in times of emergency. The inability of the Weimar Republic to respond effectively to the political and economic crises of the early 20th century, such as the Great Depression, was a symptom of this dysfunction. In Schmitt's eyes, the failure of parliamentary democracy to act decisively in times of crisis leads to a loss of state authority, which opens the door for authoritarian alternatives to emerge. The rise of authoritarian alternatives. Schmitt's critique of parliamentary democracy is not merely an academic exercise. He is deeply concerned about the political consequences of the crisis he identifies. Schmitt believed that the inability of the Weimar Republic to address the challenges of modern politics would ultimately pave the way for the rise of authoritarian or even totalitarian alternatives. He was especially concerned about the rise of movements like National Socialism, which promised strong, decisive leadership in contrast to the inefficiency of parliamentary democracy. Schmitt saw the authoritarian turn as a response to the dysfunction of parliamentary systems, and he suggested that only a strong executive could provide the kind of leadership necessary to preserve the state in times of crisis. He argued that the traditional mechanisms of parliamentary democracy, such as legislative debates, coalition building, and party negotiations, were ill-suited to the challenges of the modern world, where swift and decisive action was required. In his view, the rise of strong, centralized power could be justified as a means of preserving order and protecting the state from disintegration. In The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy, Schmitt makes a controversial case for the necessity of authoritarian rule in times of crisis. He does not necessarily advocate for the totalitarianism that would later emerge in Nazi Germany, but he does argue that a strong leader with the ability to act unilaterally is essential for maintaining political stability. For Schmitt, this strong leader is the embodiment of the sovereign, the one who can decide in times of emergency when normal procedures break down. The paradox of Schmitt's argument is that the crisis of parliamentary democracy, which is characterized by the breakdown of normal procedures, could only be resolved by the establishment of new, more authoritarian forms of governance. The decisionism of Schmitt. A key component of Schmitt's political theory is the concept of decisionism, the idea that political authority is ultimately based on the capacity to make decisions. For Schmitt, the essence of politics is the ability to make decisions that determine the course of events. Parliamentary systems, with their emphasis on consensus, debate, and negotiation, are fundamentally unable to make the kinds of decisions that are required in times of crisis. In Schmitt's view, true political authority is not about negotiating between parties or adhering to legal norms. It is about having the strength and authority to make decisive choices in moments of existential threat. Schmitt's decisionism is rooted in his broader philosophical and legal views, which are deeply influenced by the crisis of modernity. In the face of the collapse of traditional structures of authority, Schmitt sees the need for a new form of sovereignty that is capable of asserting itself over the chaos and uncertainty of modern political life. He suggests that political authority must be grounded in the ability to make decisions that transcend the fragmented, procedural nature of parliamentary democracy. Schmitt's influence and criticism. The crisis of parliamentary democracy has had a lasting impact on political theory, especially in the context of debates about sovereignty, democracy, and authoritarianism. Schmitt's critique of parliamentary democracy resonated in the interwar period as the failure of liberal democratic institutions to address the challenges of economic collapse, political extremism, and rising nationalism became increasingly apparent. Schmitt's emphasis on sovereignty and the state of emergency has influenced later political thinkers, particularly in the fields of legal and political theory. However, Schmitt's ideas have also been widely criticized for their potential to justify authoritarianism and the erosion of democratic values. His advocacy for a strong executive and his willingness to embrace political decisionism have led many critics to accuse him of supporting totalitarianism. Schmitt's relationship with the Nazi regime, although he later distanced himself from some of its more extreme elements, further complicates his legacy. His political philosophy remains controversial, particularly because of his apparent justification for authoritarian measures in the face of political crises. Carl Schmitt's The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy is a powerful and provocative critique of the parliamentary system, one that raises important questions about the nature of democracy, sovereignty, and the state. Schmitt's arguments about the inadequacy of parliamentary procedures, the dangers of political party fragmentation, and the need for decisive action in times of crisis continue to resonate in contemporary political debates. While his ideas have been controversial and criticized for their potential to justify authoritarianism, They remain an essential part of the intellectual history of political thought, offering a compelling, if deeply pessimistic, analysis of the challenges facing modern democracy.